Hello, Redhawks, and welcome to our next video in our accessibility series. In this video, we'll look at tables and how to make them accessible and proper uses of tables within Canvas. So what does it mean when we're looking at making accessible tables? Basically, we want to make sure that we're using tables for the right reason, first and foremost, that we're taking information, probably data more than likely, and putting it into tables for students to be able to view. So we're taking complex, large amounts of information and putting them into tables so they're easy to view and understand. What we don't want to do is use those for formatting purposes in order to keep images in place or to lay out our navigation of our course. There's other ways to accomplish those types of things which are much more accessible. So why is this important? Once again, screen readers become the main topic of conversation here. When we're using a table, the screen reader is going to read through the table cell by cell, starting with row 1, column 1, and then it's just going to announce what's in each cell. So you can imagine when I got down to, say, row 7, column 5, I might not have any idea what that data is correlated to if I can only take that information in via the screen reader. When we put headers into tables, then a good screen reader will announce the name of the header and then what the piece of data is that correlates with it. So we want to make sure that when we're using tables that we use them for those purposes. Obviously, using tables, like we alluded to on the previous slide, for complex information, it just makes it easier for all learners, regardless of disability, to be able to go through and just scan that to find information a little bit easier. But again, when it comes to structure, we want to avoid using them to do things like space out items and create margins and dividers. Again, there's some other ways. Canvas is currently in the process of putting together some tools that make structuring and layout a lot better. Unfortunately, at this point, they're not available yet. We don't really have a definitive timeline as of the recording of this video. But when we do, obviously, we'll make sure we get that information out so that we can use those to make our courses as user-friendly as possible while keeping them accessible. So we'll switch over here to Canvas to look at what an example of this might look like in Canvas. Not really easy to do within the PowerPoint slide like we do on some of the other videos in this series. I just went through and put together a real basic table. And you look at it and think, okay, that's a good table that looks like it should work. And again, if you are not working with any sort of disability or impairment, this table would work just fine, because if I wanted to know the pH level for experiment 102, I know I can just easily go find the intersection of those 2 points and find out what this is. But again, when that screen reader starts to go through, it's going to read each of these cells individually and just keep going through all of them. So when I get to 6.8, I might be able to use some common sense and go, well, that's probably based off the other numbers that have been in these groups, probably the pH level. But again, here's an 8.9, that's relatively close, so that could throw us off. Again, when we go through and put the header row in here, it'll say pH level 6.8. So it'll go through and tell us experiment ID 102, and then temperature 37. So now a little easier to follow along knowing that we're on experiment ID 102, the temperature was 37, the pH level was 6.8, so on and so forth. But we have to set that up the right way. I find it's actually easiest in Canvas to put the table together as I want it and get everything set up like I like, and then let the accessibility checker do the heavy lift for me and go down and click on my accessibility checker. The first thing it's going to do is ask us to add a caption. A good accessible table will always have a caption. So we're going to just go ahead and call this data collection, and then make sure we click on apply. And you'll see then it just gives us this title at the top. So now again, as we're going down, we hit a table. We can't see the table, we can only hear the table. We know that the table called data collection gives us some idea of what's going on. And then the next, it'll ask us table headers should specify scope. So what do we want to specify? More than likely, you're just going to want to focus on either row or column here. Row group and column group would be used if you're getting into some more complex tables where you have multiple groups of data that all have multiple columns and rows underneath it. If you run into a situation where you think that might be something you need to do, probably easier just to reach out to me and we can kind of work through that individual process together, because more than likely those aren't going to get used a whole bunch. So when we say row header or column header, remembering the up and downs are the columns and the horizontals are the rows. So if we want to have row headers, then we would state row header. Here we want the columns to have headers, so we're going to choose column. So if you mark the first one, then it's going to go through and continue to ask us what do we want to do with each of these header rows. So again, we're going to put a header at the top of each of the columns. And then it'll tell us that we are accessible. Now, what does that do? Because you'll say, well, that didn't do anything. Everything looks exactly the same. If we go down here and click on our HTML editor, again, you don't need to know necessarily how to do this, but just so you understand what happens. So it's going to announce that there's a table. Then it'll see there's a caption, what that table contains. Then it'll go through and knows that each of these are the column headers. So when it goes through and reads the information, it knows that it's going to go through and look at the experiment IDs, the temperature, the pH level, and the reaction time. And then it knows that in each one of these table rows, the data within each cell aligns with each one of the columns. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you look at the code here. Just know that it makes it possible for the screen reader to be able to keep all those things together and make it come out in a coherent manner for somebody that couldn't see the table. Okay, and then to go ahead and review things we want to do, make sure that we're using tables for displaying data, not for layout. Again, there's other ways to display a lot of information. Just using lists, like we talk about in another video, works well. Some of the editor tools that Canvas is going to release will help for some of those things. Really, the only time a table belongs in a Canvas page is if you have a set of data that needs to be explained or shown. Make sure we're always including a header row, and then keep your tables as simple as possible. Didn't show you on the previous example, but try not to merge cells. They work well as far as visual cue, but they don't work well with screen readers and for accessibility purposes. And then make sure that our headers are concise and descriptive, just so it doesn't get to be super repetitive when the screen reader has to constantly announce what column or row you might be in. A lot of our don'ts are just going to be the opposite of the do's. The one that is worth mentioning, though, is the last point. Don't paste in screenshots of tables. Make sure you actually create the table within the page itself. If you have a screenshot, that would require alt text, and if you have alt text, putting all the information from a table in there would be super complicated, so you're better off just to put the table into the page to begin with. So overall, tables are one of the probably trickier things to make sure that you're making accessible. Fortunately, a lot of times they can be avoided, and when they can't be avoided, it's not too difficult, especially with the use of the accessibility checker, to make sure that you have things set up properly so that students can access the information as you intend them to.